Hello. Today we celebrate the Epiphany. Our first reading is from Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 through 6. Our psalm is Psalm 72. Our second reading is from Ephesians chapter 3, verses 2 to 6. And our gospel is from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Human beings are funny creatures. We always think that we know something. We always think that we have it all figured out. And King Herod and his subjects were no different. You see, Herod was appointed king of Judea by the Romans in 40 BC. Now, he did not have the traditional Jewish heritage in order to be king. His mother was Arabic. His father was an Edomite descended from Esau. And if you remember, Abraham had two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. And Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob had 12 sons whose descendants became the 12 tribes of Israel. All the kings of Israel can be led back to being descendants of one of these 12 sons, King David, King Solomon, all the way through to Jesus. The royal bloodline had always been through Isaac's son Jacob, not Esau. Esau's descendants became the Edomites, and Herod was one of these. His family had converted to Judaism, and his father had been the financial governor of the Roman province of Judea. Now, he might not have had the exact right Jewish lineage to be king of Israel, but Herod had figured a few things out. He kept himself close to the Romans as his father had, and he knew who buttered his bread. He had it all figured out. He was made king of Israel. And the people, they didn't necessarily like him. He wasn't really Jewish enough, and he kissed up to the Romans a little bit too much. But he was the ruler that they had, and by virtue of having Herod named as king, the Judean province had just a little bit of autonomy from Rome. They were able to preserve some of their Jewish identity within the Roman Empire. Oh yes, things were going well, until the Magi showed up. Now the Magi showed up, and in the pictures they're always trotting up on their camels, and they want to see the new king of the Jews. And you can imagine Herod saying, "You want to see the king of who now?" Even with his 9 wives and a bunch of concubines, Herod probably kept up with if he was having a new son or not. And the Gospel says that in addition to Herod being troubled at the prospect of being replaced, all Jerusalem was troubled with him. And not necessarily because they liked Herod, but he was the devil that they knew. He was the illegitimate king that they knew how to deal with. The one that they had figured out. So of course they would prefer him to some other Roman puppet. And now, if it was not to be a Roman puppet king of the Jews, if it was in fact the real king of the Jews, the Messiah, well, that's kind of troubling for people too. Because if it's the Messiah, why didn't the scribes and the Pharisees and the religious leaders know about it? Why are these pagan, foreign, camel-riding heathens the ones who knew about the new king? Why did they figure it out? When we're the ones who actually have everything figured out, the people must have thought. And a lot of times we figure everything out, and it comes as a shock, and it's troubling when we find out that we're wrong, or that we've missed something. I think we can all relate to all Jerusalem being troubled, especially the religious crowd, the faithful followers of God, because like us, they were supposed to be watching for the Messiah. They should have seen Jesus coming. They had had about 2,000 years from Abraham to Jesus to figure out all kinds of stuff. And they had scrolls and scrolls full of teachings and wisdom and rules to live by and tradition. 2,000 years of tradition. So of course it was troubling to all Jerusalem to have potentially missed the one thing that they had spent 2,000 years building tradition around. Now, you know, we Christians are a lot like the people in our readings today. We've had 2,000 years now to build our tradition. We've got books and books full of teachings and wisdoms and rules and traditions, 2,000 years worth of tradition. We've got it all figured out, and like the folks in the gospel today, we are troubled when confronted with the possibility that we might have missed the coming of the Messiah, that we might have missed Jesus among us. We wouldn't really miss Jesus, would we? I mean, we've got this stuff figured out. We know who's who, what's what. There's no surprises anymore. We just stick to what we've already figured out for 2,000 years. And through a misrepresentation of papal infallibility, we decide that not only have we figured everything out, but that we're never wrong about anything either. Now, that's not really what papal infallibility means. Papal infallibility refers to the Pope declaring a specific teaching to be infallible, ex cathedra, from the chair of Peter. There are only 2 actual ex cathedra teachings: Mary's Immaculate Conception, declared by Pope Pius IX in 1854, and the Assumption of Mary, declared by Pope Pius XII in 1950. Now, there are a great many other teachings that are considered to be true and infallible, possessing the binding quality of an infallible doctrine. though not proclaimed by a pope ex cathedra per se. Instead, these teachings rely on the magisterial authority, the teaching authority of the church, the deposit of faith. Like many things, now this is only as clear as mud, but Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, outlined different levels or categories of teaching, and he provides a non-exhaustive list of teachings considered to be infallible. For instance, the creed, the sacraments, the real presence, original sin, immortality of the human soul, grave immorality of murder, male-only priesthood, canonization of saints, supreme primacy of the pontiff. And Pope Benedict then went on to describe a category or level of teachings, the ordinary teachings on faith and morals, that are referred to as non-definitive and reformable. Now, unfortunately, Benedict did not provide a list of these reformable teachings, so theologians and armchair theologians and all the rest of us can debate what teachings fall into this category, teachings that might need to be reformed. And as you can imagine, there are those that think every teaching that's not specifically listed in the top categories belongs in this reform category. And of course, there are others that don't believe any teachings should be in this reform category. So who's to say? The point is that even a traditionalist historian, pope, such as Benedict, recognized that there are potentially a lot of teachings that could be reformed. And because Benedict was a historian, he knew that the church, over its 2,000-year history, had made some mistakes, especially in the morals department, and that we had changed direction many times. And it all started with our second reading today. That was one of the first times the church reversed course. Prior to Paul, the gospel was preached to Jews almost exclusively, and a Gentile who believed had to convert to Judaism, and then convert to Christianity from Judaism. You see, the Christian community was made up of Jews who had 2,000 years of tradition that taught them that Gentiles were unclean, unworthy heathens. You wouldn't waste your time on someone like that trying to spread the gospel. But Paul said in our reading today that the Gentiles are co-heirs, co-partners, members of the same body of Christ. And Paul went to Jerusalem and met with Peter and James and the other apostles to hash this whole thing out, to figure out that contrary to 2,000 years of tradition, Gentiles were okay. They were deserving of inclusion in the Christian faith by virtue of their being made in the image and likeness of God, because they were people with inherent dignity, children of God, co-heirs and partners in the promise of salvation through Jesus Christ. They didn't have to become Jewish first. Jesus could save them just the way they were. But even though that is what they decided at the Council of Jerusalem, it wasn't always smooth sailing. It is hard when you think you know something and then find out you have to change what you thought you knew. In the book of Galatians, Paul recounts having to tell Peter, to his face, he says. Paul had to rebuke Peter, the Pope, for not treating the Gentiles right. You see, Peter would eat with Gentiles when he was only with other Gentiles. But if there were any of his Jewish buddies around, suddenly he was too good to eat with them old dirty Gentiles. And Paul told him that that was messed up. Peter's hypocrisy regarding the Gentiles was leading others to ostracize them too. You see, sometimes even the Pope can have the wrong attitude, the wrong actions, and can get believers headed in the wrong direction. As a church, we don't always have it all figured out. And this continues to go on throughout our history. Things that we've been wrong about. Holy wars, crusades, the Inquisition, colonialism, slavery, tacit support of Hitler's agenda, and more recently, the abuse cover-up, the tacit support and approval of U.S. immigration policy, and homophobia. Now, a lot of these things we've been wrong about are because we thought we had things all figured out. You know, colonialism made sense at the time because we were saving those savages from their pagan worship and making them Catholic, so that at least when they died in the silver mine for us, they'd go to heaven. And slavery, we didn't really oppose that because everybody was doing it. And when popes spoke out against it, popes such as Eugene IV, Paul III, Gregory XIV, Urban VIII, and Benedict XIV, when they did speak out against it, we Catholics, including bishops and priests, just ignored them. That's an example of us having it figured out better than even the Pope. Another example is the Concordat of 1933 between the Vatican and the Third Reich, the Nazis. This agreement, at best, was an agreement to look the other way regarding Germany's Jews, in exchange for Catholics not going to the gas chamber with them. At its worst, It was a legitimizing document for Hitler's government. It was church approval for his policies. Perhaps it was the only way to save the institution, and sometimes that's the most important thing to us. We thought we had it figured out how to save the institution again with this abuse cover-up. We can see how that has turned out. And now we knew that we had everything figured out a couple of years ago when 52% of Catholics voted for this immigration policy. Because this policy was always on the table. This is not a surprise. We knew what the policy regarding immigration was, but we also knew that we could end up with an anti-abortion Supreme Court justice, and we knew that that was important. 2,000 years of tradition have taught us that we Catholics vote against abortion. That's just what we do. Well, we haven't saved any babies yet, but we have had 2 immigrant children who were fleeing their own version of Herod die while in immigration custody. So there's that. Now we also figure that we have it all worked out regarding homosexuality in the church. We are sticking with our 2,000-year tradition of intrinsically disordered language. And this might be one of those reformable teachings, I don't know. But I know that just as we ignored the popes about slavery, we ignore the catechism on how to treat LGBT persons. The catechism says they must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided, which means that you can't fire someone for being gay, or refuse their funeral, or their baptism, or communion, or keep them from being a Eucharistic minister, or a lector, or an usher, or any other discriminatory thing that we do in parishes across the country to push LGBT people to the periphery. It seems that we think we have an awful lot of things figured out. But like the scribes and the Pharisees, the faithful followers of the Jewish tradition in our gospel today, we very often miss Jesus while we are figuring all this stuff out. And like Herod and all Jerusalem, we are troubled when we find out we might have missed his coming. And like Herod and many of the scribes and Pharisees, we decide that no, in fact, we did not miss Jesus. Those magi were wrong. And we dive back into our tradition to figure a way to block this Jesus of Nazareth, to discredit and abandon him, and ultimately to crucify him. Because what he's telling us doesn't jive with our 2,000 years of tradition, and we don't think that we could ever have been wrong about anything that we figured out. But when we stand in front of God on our judgment day, we will say to the Lord, "When did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or ill, or in prison, and not minister to your needs?" And he will answer us, "Amen, I say to you, what you did not do for one of these least ones, you did not do for me. When you built your wall, you kept me out." On this Feast of Epiphany, don't let your heart be troubled that Jesus comes to us from sometimes unexpected sources with unexpected news. Don't be upset that he sometimes challenges what we think we have figured out. Don't fight against God when he's trying to fix our 2,000-year-old tradition. Don't refuse to recognize Jesus because you think you have it all figured out. Don't ignore Jesus among us for the sake of 2,000 years of tradition. Don't miss out on the Epiphany.